So far, the MCP servers that we have created have followed the host, client, and server architecture. In this architecture, as you already know, you have an application, for example, Claude Desktop or ChatGPT Desktop, and every application has its own host process within the operating system. In this architecture, client or MCP client is executed within the host process of the host application. And also the client loads the MCP server in the same process. And client talks to MCP server through a protocol called STDIO or standard IO. In reality, MCP server and MCP client are on two different computers or machines, probably even in two different parts of the world. In that case, standard IO protocol is not useful for us. If MCP server and MCP client are on two different computers, then you will need to use a protocol called streamable HTTP. In this architecture, you have an application, and this application is normally an AI agent. When it's executed, a host process is created for it. Your MCP client is loaded in that host process, and then your MCP server is also executed like an application, and therefore it will have its own host process. Now the client needs to talk to your MCP server over HTTP, and this is called the streamable HTTP. The reason that this protocol is called streamable HTTP is that by default this HTTP client is stayed active and live, and therefore the MCP server is stateful by default. When you connect to MCP server via streamable HTTP protocol, a session is created by default, a session ID is assigned to that session by default, and the connection stays open unless you pause it, which in that case you can resume it, or to close it completely. And this is by design, and it's designed to allow servers to send events to clients. Those events are called server sent events or SSE, which enables the client to have meaningful conversation with MCP. For example, the client can send one request to MCP server and then receive the answer, use the answer in generative AI, and if it needs more information, goes back to MCP server and asks a question. And because the session is available, every question or request from client to server can be correlated to previous questions or requests, and therefore the conversation will be meaningful, pausable, and so forth. Let's go to Visual Studio and show you that how we can create a streamable HTTP connection between a client and a server. Back to Visual Studio, as you already know, we have a MCP server that is tool, and we can run this. As you already see, there is no MCP run command in it, and we have not said whether you want to use a streamable HTTP or not. If you don't say that you want to use a streamable HTTP, then the default protocol is STDIO or standard IO. And I run this tool because I want to have access to inspector, so I can just say MCP dev server. It brings up the inspector, and as you can see, there is a transport type here, standard IO. And if I change UV, because not all of you may have the UV tool, to MCP, I can connect to my MCP server via standard IO. And let's say I can get the list of tools, for example. If I open the dropdown of transport type, you can see SSE. That is a protocol. SSE stands for server sent events. Streamable HTTP is a more modern and better version of SSE, so always use streamable HTTP for remote MCP servers. As soon as I change transport type to HTTP, then this URL appears here, because as you already know, your MCP server is supposed to be somewhere remote. If you run your MCP server on any address, like for example this URL, the HTTP endpoint is always accessible via /MCP. And if I change it to streamable HTTP, I cannot connect back to it because it doesn't support streamable HTTP. I leave this open because I need it. Let's go back to Visual Studio. Now in Visual Studio, I have another directory called streamable HTTP, this one. I have a server.py in it, and this server.py is a copy of server.py under tool directory, which is basically a tool that we created. And as we said, by default, the protocol is standard IO. How can we say that we want to use a streamable HTTP? So for streamable HTTP, you need to run your MCP server and call the mcp.run command, because when we use the dev one, like this one, this command, mcp dev is only for testing and debugging, and therefore it uses a standard I/O protocol, and that is why we don't need to run our MCP server. However, if you want to access it via HTTP, you need to run it, and let me show you how we run it. To run it, you just go to the bottom of your code and you just say MCP run. Now you can just use a Python command and run this, for example, Python and then server.py, but still the protocol is not a streamable HTTP. One way of running your MCP server with streamable HTTP is that you pass transport type parameter to it, and the value can be SSE, STDIO, or streamable HTTP, and you choose streamable HTTP. Now to run it, I need a new terminal. Now I can say Python server. As you can see, this time it's running UVcorns, which because FastMCP is based on FastAPI, and I have this URL, which is localhost listening on port 8000. Now if we go back in here and I try to connect again, you will see that I can connect over streamable HTTP to that address and there is no problem. And if I go to tools and say list tools, I can get the list of my tools, which is greetings. Let's go to inspect in Google Chrome and go to network, and I click on list tools again. Let's look at this request that we sent. So the request, as you can see, has accept, and it accepts application JSON and also text event stream. Because we are opening a stateful connection, we need to accept text event stream. Also, if you can see, there is a MCP-session ID header so that we can maintain session. We will work on the stateful MCP servers in the next lecture in more details. And the connection type is keep alive, because this is not stateless, this is stateful. So that's how it works. Now back to Visual Studio. Another way to run your MCP server is using MCP run and then SSE async, STDIO async, or streamable HTTP async. If you want to run your MCP server in asynchronous way, you can import async IO. You can create a main function, and in here you can say await MCP run streamable HTTP async. And if you want to run this, you can say that if name is main, then async IO run main. Now again, if I say Python server, it runs it, but this time it's async. Async is preferred in MCP SDK. That is it. Let's go to next lecture and work on stateful and stateless MCP servers and learn about session management in MCP servers.